Welcome to Atlantic Canada's Hydrogen Journey, the podcast that dives into the opportunities, challenges, and realities of the emerging hydrogen sector here in Atlantic Canada. I'm your host, Derek Estabrook, Executive Director of the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance. In this episode, we're exploring how low-carbon hydrogen can be used right here in Atlantic Canada. While large-scale hydrogen export projects have been grabbing headlines, there's also an opportunity to use hydrogen to cut emissions and drive economic growth in our region. Where will hydrogen have the biggest impact? And how can we get started? To help answer these questions and more, I'm joined today by Dr. David Layzell and Sandy Schembri. David is an emeritus professor at the University of Calgary and an energy systems architect for the Transition Accelerator. His work focuses on how low-carbon electricity, hydrogen, and biofuels can all work together to power our net zero future. Sandy is an associate partner at NorthStar Public Affairs and the former director of policy to Canada's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. He has helped shape Canada's clean energy and climate policies and now advises leaders navigating the evolving energy sector. But before we dive into today's podcast, if you're interested in learning more about Atlantic Canada's hydrogen future, don't miss the Hydrogen East Conference on April 14th and 15th in Halifax. I'll put the registration link in the show notes. Sandy and David, welcome to the podcast. So Dave, to kick us off, can you tell us a little bit about your work in the domestic hydrogen sector?
Yes, for a number of years now, I've been trying to identify the sectors and locations across Canada where hydrogen makes makes the most sense as a zero-emission energy carrier for the transition of Canada to a net zero future. And when a promising opportunity arises, what we've been trying to do is to work with innovative companies, with governments, and some academics to set up pilots and demonstration projects. And we've done this, for example, in hydrogen fuel cell buses, trials in Edmonton and Strathcona in Alberta, hydrogen use in heavy-duty trucks and locomotives, and also hydrogen for space heating in commercial buildings, and in maybe a number of new ways to make, store, and transport hydrogen when it has really low greenhouse gas emissions.
Great. Thanks, David. And Sandy, you've worked on hydrogen more from the policy side. So can you share a little bit about some of the work that you did while you were in the public sector?
Yeah, that's right, Derek. So my entire experience in the hydrogen domain came from my time as Director of Policy to Minister Jonathan Wilkinson at Energy and Natural Resources Canada, where we were new to hydrogen as well. You know, this was a new opportunity that emerged during his tenure in that office, and primarily as a result, in my view, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Europe's renewed interest in accelerating their transition away from Russian sources of oil and gas, but also really enhancing their energy security and their climate ambitions. And so we worked very closely with the government of Germany to launch the Canada-Germany Hydrogen Alliance. At the same time, the United States had introduced the Inflation Recovery Act, which provided some very generous incentives to hydrogen producers under the 45V credits. And at that time, Canada was in a position to ensure that we could seize the opportunity associated with this emerging global market, and had to quickly introduce something that would allow Canadian hydrogen producers to remain competitive. And so we worked closely with the Department of Finance on establishing the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit.
Interesting. Thanks. So Dave, we hear a lot about clean electricity and about electrification. But can you tell us a little bit about why we can't just electrify everything, or so what makes hydrogen essential in the net zero transition?
Well, as a zero emission energy carrier, electricity, actually zero emission electricity made without carbon emission, is actually incredible. And it's ideal for so many different end use applications, but it does have its limitations. It's really expensive to store, especially if you want to do it in large amounts, so over long periods of time. Batteries are heavy and they can take a long time to recharge. So if you need to get in and get recharged quickly, if you're traveling, for example, with heavy vehicles or trains, that's a problem. It's also expensive to move really long distance, especially in very large amounts. In fact, you can moving large amounts of energy. It's cheaper to move energy as a chemical in a pipeline than it is to move it in wires. And there's also low-cost, zero-emission electricity, is from renewables, but the generation, of course, of renewables tends to be intermittent, and often with strong seasonal trends. So it doesn't always work. In our current energy system, electricity accounts for 20 to 25% of our end-use demands, with 75 to 80% being chemically based energy. In a net zero future, our analysis is we may be able to increase the role of electricity to 50 or even maybe 55, 60%. But where are we going to get the rest of the energy we need? And this is where hydrogen and biofuels come in as chemically based versions of zero emission energy carriers to help meet society needs for low carbon energy.
So Dave, what do you think are some of those use cases where hydrogen may be a better fit than direct electrification?
Well, a number of them. For example, heavy-duty Class 8 trucks, especially if they're long haul. This is very difficult for battery electric vehicles to meet that sector's needs. Locomotives, again, really, especially in the freight locomotives, but also in trains that are used for commuting trains. Municipal bus fleets, especially if you're talking the 40-foot to 60-foot buses that are requiring 200 or more kilometers per day, and especially in winter when you're going to need energy to heat the bus as well as drive it. Marine applications, although for bigger ships, ammonia seems to be more likely to the zero emission fuel of choice. There are some applications where we may find that hydrogen is actually can work as compressed hydrogen or liquid hydrogen. Off-road equipment, we're talking farms, construction, mining. Again, some cases hydrogen or ammonia, which is made from hydrogen, can be a zero-emission energy carrier. And maybe in the long term, jet fuel. Right in the short term, we're probably looking at biofuels really dominating as a sustainable aviation fuel because it takes a long time to change over infrastructure in long-distance air transport around the world. But I think in the long term, hydrogen's very light and it could be an ideal jet fuel. In fact, liquid hydrogen's a rocket fuel now. So, perhaps it's only coming back to one of its origins. And I think there's also potentially some roles in industrial heat and even space heating for large commercial buildings in certain areas of Canada that might make sense.
So that's a lot of potential uses. Many of them are somewhat niche. So if we look ahead, do you think hydrogen in Atlantic Canada is going to be used broadly by Atlantic Canadians the way we think about battery electric vehicles or electric heat pumps in our homes? So do we think we're going to be using hydrogen very broadly like that, or do you think realistically that the applications for hydrogen here in Atlantic Canada might be more limited?
Well, I think if the energy systems of Atlantic Canada and other parts of Canada are going to achieve net zero, hydrogen and its derivatives like ammonia, for example, will need to play a fairly significant role. I think it's important to recognize that energy transitions are rarely, if ever, really driven by the free market. I consider that the major features that define Canada's current energy systems today, for example, large hydro in Labrador and Quebec, in Manitoba and BC, the nuclear power in British Columbia and Ontario, Trans-Canada Pipeline that brings natural gas to Eastern Canada, and development of in-situ oil sands. All of these were basically led by visionaries in government. We're wanting to make a better Canada. And really that's where we are today. I think what we need to do in order to make hydrogen, actually to achieve net zero, it's not only just about hydrogen, it's about our other major transition to zero emission energy carriers. What we need is a shared vision and government leadership for a compelling net zero future. And without it, we're not really going to transform our energy systems. So it does require developing a shared vision for what is the strategic role of hydrogen, and then basically government leadership to help basically take a leadership role where industry can follow through and do what industry does best.
Right. So Sandy, so thinking about all of these different applications that David has outlined for hydrogen, the reality is it's still a new concept for a lot of people. So thinking with your policy hat on, what do you think needs to happen to help the public kind of better understand its role in our energy future?
Well, first and foremost, I agree with David that we need visionary leaders in the public sector. So individuals like my former boss, Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, his provincial counterparts. We've had premiers throughout Atlantic Canada, most notably Premier Tim Houston, Nova Scotia, Premier Andrew Furey in Newfoundland and Labrador, speaking about the economic potential for their respective jurisdictions. And I think where Dave just very articulately walked through the potential end uses for hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives, that's incredibly helpful for the public in terms of developing awareness. But it's probably a good idea for us to step back just a tiny little bit to help to define what the problem set actually is that we're using hydrogen to address here. And for the most part, I mean, aside from maybe a few ideologues across the country, we are relatively, we've achieved a degree of consensus about the need to fight climate change. Where we haven't fully developed a common understanding is what the best way to do that is. And hydrogen has a pretty obvious role in some of the end use cases that David just defined. But most Canadians, when they think about fighting climate change, and particularly in Atlantic Canada, we don't really see the kinds of opportunities to use hydrogen in the immediate near term to immediately reduce emissions. If you look at Canada's emissions reduction plan, it has maybe 10% of the total emissions reductions that we're looking for below the 2005 levels coming from hydrogen. And so that means that about 25 megatons towards our ERP targets have to come from hydrogen. And so I think maybe most Nova Scotians, Newfoundlanders, and Labradorians aren't thinking about we have to decarbonize our electricity generating sector. That's not going to come from hydrogen. We have to get combustion engines off the road. That's not going to come from hydrogen. So I think what's really important to define what role hydrogen will play and what role it won't play, and then how do jurisdictions in Atlantic Canada actually participate in the hydrogen supply and value chain. And that's, from my perspective at least, more likely to come from the production of green hydrogen, production of green ammonia, given the potential to generate low-cost renewables from wind, from solar, from other sources in Atlantic Canada.
Interesting. Okay. One of the big challenges that I often get involved in my role as executive director of the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance is trying to solve this chicken and egg dilemma, where we've got this challenge of developing, supply and demand. So we need production, but it's hard to build production without demand, and it's hard to build demand for hydrogen in Atlantic Canada without, the availability of consistent and reliable supply. So I'm interested, David, in your thoughts about how can we solve this chicken and egg dilemma here in Atlantic Canada?
No, it's a real challenge, and it's a challenge not only in Atlantic Canada, it's across Canada, around the world. Compared to electrification, or even compared to drop-in fuels, so biofuels, the transition to hydrogen is a heavier lift in some ways. Even though it's the lightest molecule in the universe, it's a heavy lift. That's because we don't have the hydrogen value chains in place that could be harnessed to support this transition to a hydrogen economy. We already have an electrical grid, and we have actually the systems in place for producing, distributing, and using carbon-based fuels, but not for hydrogen. And like any chain, the hydrogen value chain is only as good as its weakest link. So I see the key role for, I would say, for a hydrogen hub is to bring all of the key stakeholders together to create a robust value chain in areas that really make sense. And I would argue the ones that are probably closest to be the most compelling role for hydrogen is heavy-duty vehicles, trucking, trains, and maybe some off-road vehicles like mining vehicles. But the key issue there is you need a coalition of the willing industries that are willing to work together with a shared vision for building this new value chain and creating a really strong value chain where every link in the chain is equally robust. And I think that's the challenge that we have.
So you mentioned the importance of developing hydrogen hubs. Could you explain, like, what would a hydrogen hub in Atlantic Canada potentially look like? Like, what are the different parts of that hub?
Well, I would say it depends a little bit on what the end use is and where the application is, because we certainly have a role now, even in Atlantic Canada, where hydrogen is being used in refineries, right, to crack heavy oils, basically into gasoline and diesel. One could see hydrogen being used to make fertilizer, for example. I'm not sure there's any fertilizer plants in Eastern Canada, but there might be a lot of ammonia production in the future as an export product, and there might be opportunities to piggyback on that. One of the things that we need is a coalition of the willing. Who are the key stakeholders in this coalition, I would argue, in a new hydrogen use as an energy carrier, are the companies that are willing to buy the hydrogen and to buy the conversion technologies to deliver energy services from that hydrogen. So these are the trucking companies, or the train companies, or the the companies that are running off-road vehicles that see a value in a market and a business opportunity for them to purchase not only the vehicles, but actually purchase the hydrogen, the fuel hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen that will actually allow them to deliver their energy services. And then they can't do this on their own, and they're going to need other companies and government support and academics and training communities, for how to use and maintain these vehicles, to create this shared vision, to develop a robust value chain that will allow us to achieve this target of a transition to zero emission energy carriers.
Okay, so let's imagine then that we want to create a hydrogen hub in Atlantic Canada, and we need to get started. I'm interested, I guess, a question for both of you. Maybe I'll start with you, Sandy, from a policy or a regulatory side. Like, what do you think some of the first steps are that we would need to take to make a hydrogen hub in Atlantic Canada a reality?
Yes, I mean, at the risk of sounding reductive, I'd say the very first thing you need in a hydrogen hub is some hydrogen. And today we've had a huge expression of interest from many proponents across Atlantic Canada, across Canada, frankly, in entering the production of green molecule market. But absent the development of a mature end-use market in Canada, we've been very much dependent on European markets to emerge as an offtake market, and therefore no producers have come to a final investment decision yet. And we've got to think, going back to the chicken and egg discussion, if you're, say, Irving Oil in St. John, New Brunswick, and to Dave's point, I do believe that they likely produce their own hydrogen from natural gas, gray hydrogen, to blend into the refining process, they're not going to start to make the investment decisions, and they're not going to start thinking about reconfiguring their production processes to enable the consumption of green molecules, maybe being shipped in from somewhere else in Atlantic Canada, until there is a reliable and secure source of production somewhere that's economically viable for them to ship it. So I think first and foremost, we need hydrogen. How are we going to get that? Governments, the project proponents themselves need to work together to really de-risk the investment. And right now we have some really great mechanisms that help. The Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit provides 40% of the capex on a project, but that's on the back end, and it doesn't really address what I think is the most pervasive short-term commercial impediment to projects taking FID, and that's securing commercial offtake. Whereas I know you know well, there remains a gap between the production cost of a green molecule, the current cost of a fossil fuel derived source of fuel today, and then even if you're adding on various regulatory requirements that need to be met, there's still a gap, and that gap needs to be closed somehow. And I think absent our ability to collectively address these constraints, we're not going to see the emergence of the production, and that makes it very difficult to even work within a coalition of the willing to establish a broader hub that captures the rest of the supply chain.
Right. So David, then thinking from a more technical side, if your job was to get a hub going in Atlantic Canada, like what do you think you'd want to do first, beyond what Sandy has talked about?
Well, I think what Sandy's talked about is extremely important, is to look at where we're going to get the hydrogen from, especially low carbon hydrogen, and how we can get it economically viable. But I think you're creating a value chain, and I would say at the same time we've got to start getting the coalition of the willing to purchase and maybe pay a little bit of a premium for their fuel, and certainly a premium they're going to have for their conversion technologies. So they need a fuel cell truck or a locomotive or something that runs on hydrogen. Then that's a premium cost for sure, and it's a challenge. So risk reduction, but also it's getting the coalition of the companies that see value in this and that are willing to partner together. What we found, at least in the work we've been doing in Western Canada, is that the companies that are wanting to produce low carbon hydrogen see themselves in steep competition with one another. Whereas the companies that are interested in using hydrogen for vehicles or for off-road vehicles or whatever, they see themselves as partners. Even though they might compete in the same business, they might be in the trucking business, for example, and there may be competitors, but they know that the more trucks on the road that use hydrogen, the more economically viable and the less risky this whole transition will be. And I think a key thing that I would encourage for the Atlantic Canada hydrogen, emergent of Atlantic Canada hydrogen hub, is really to focus again on the entire value chain, but really a strong focus on trying to identify who are the companies that are willing to take a little risk, when obviously they want some government's going to help them to reduce that risk, but that are willing to actually try hydrogen out to basically help in developing a branding around the value of hydrogen as a transition fuel, a net zero fuel for the future. And I think getting a strategic mass or critical mass of companies together with demand that is significant will help to bring down the price of the hydrogen supply and actually create the other key components in a value chain of the transportation and storage, and also the insurance issues and the issues around technologists who know how to maintain the equipment and build the systems that are needed, and we need all of that.
Okay, so David, you've talked a lot about bringing together a coalition of the willing. So Sandy, I'm curious to know if you think that beyond a coalition of the willing, do you think government should be doing more? So like, are there policy changes or regulations or incentives that could really help build this sector, or at least kind of kickstart it to get it going, beyond what a coalition of the willing might be prepared to do?
Yeah, and so definitely there is. And it's not to say that a lot of work has not been done. I think what the federal government has been able to do in a relatively short period of time is impressive, as have been some of the developments in other markets. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just look at other jurisdictions where they've had success in establishing a policy framework that begins to help provide market certainty, and then demand centers begin to mature. So there's two components to this in my view. And one is obviously on the demand side, induction. And so far, I don't think Canada really has established a policy framework that properly incentivizes with a carrot, or really offers the stick to catalyze a significant amount of industrial fuel switching. Whereas in the European Union, the RED 3 penalties that are part of the RFMBO framework, that really sends a strong market signal to producers that if they don't comply with those quotas for RFMBO, they're going to be subject to a relatively steep penalty. And so that begins to make the commercial case for them to begin to reconfigure their refining process if they're manufacturing steel in industrial Europe, or whether it's shipping, and that there's an incentive there because they're avoiding the penalty. The other side of it, and we've seen this be extremely successful in other markets where it's a nascent technology like offshore wind, the use of contracts for difference. And so right now, and if you put these two things together, you get a scheme that kind of closely resembles what we tried to do with the H2 Global exercise with Germany, whereby you're providing a little bit of price support to the producer on one end, but then also softening the premium that the end user is going to pay on the other end. And hopefully we'll see the structure launch relatively quickly and begin to match large-scale industrial production of hydrogen and ammonia with the end-use markets in Germany. But frankly, we need to do something like that here in Canada, so that the Irving Oil or petrochemical producers in Southern Ontario or in Fort Saskatchewan area of Alberta have an incentive to begin to assess the viability of onboarding a cleaner molecule into their existing production processes.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we have covered a lot of ground in a short period of time here. So I want to wrap up with a big picture question, and I'll ask this of both of you, but I'll start with you, David. What excites you most as you think about the future of hydrogen and the opportunity here in Atlantic Canada?
Well, I think Atlantic Canada has an incredible wind resource. I got to admit, your solar resource isn't that hot, but your wind resource, my gosh, right? Incredible wind resource, and you've got deep water ports and access, which I think is very important. And the land costs aren't outrageous. And so what you have is an ability, and I know that a lot of the discussion is about using that wind resource to make hydrogen and ammonia potentially for export to overseas. And I think that, let's be honest, our other countries of the world are willing to pay a higher price for low carbon energy than what we have tend to be being willing to do in North America. And I think there's an opportunity, though, that if we can get to scale, because there is an efficiency of scale when you're talking about hydrogen and in its production and its moving it around, that I think it's possible to piggyback a domestic hydrogen economy on an export hydrogen economy, and actually for them to help to feed each other, right? So that that one actually has an overall risk reduction for major investments in this area. And I personally think that is an exciting opportunity.
Yeah, and we heard something similar from Dave McGregor in the first episode of this podcast, where he views producing hydrogen for export and using hydrogen domestically as being very complementary, not competing with each other at all. So, Sandy, for you, what do you think is we should be keeping an eye on in the next few years as we kind of look forward to hydrogen development here in Atlantic Canada?
Well, I think there's been a degree of disappointment and skepticism in Atlantic Canada around the opportunity to deploy large-scale energy infrastructure and production projects. Given the history of the Sable offshore natural gas project in Nova Scotia, the various attempts to explore LNG, we've always kind of come in on the tail end of market growth. And I would argue that those opportunities weren't best suited for Atlantic Canada's true energy production competitive advantages. Like Dave mentioned, our wind, relatively low population density, which makes a larger scale renewables project viable. And I think what we really need to be conscious of here is ensuring that we seize the opportunity to pull together a coalition of the willing, if you will, again, and leverage that opportunity and demonstrate that we actually can do this. And if you think about offshore oil and gas that's existed in Atlantic Canada since maybe the late 70s, without being disrespectful, we are a very, very small component of the overall energy mix in North America. What's produced in Newfoundland and Labrador today, 300,000 barrels on 5 million a day, and what came out of the Sable offshore relative to the 17 BCF that Canada produced a day, it's very minor. And the opportunity that we have in Atlantic Canada is not to be a bit part player, but is to be a major world leader. And I would argue that we absolutely can, as Minister Wilkinson used to always say, walk and chew gum at the same time, in that we can produce a significant amount of hydrogen and ammonia that can be exported to Europe while providing a reliable, affordable, hopefully, domestic source of clean energy to a domestic market once that domestic market emerges.
That's terrific. So I'm feeling like there is a lot for us to be excited and hopefully optimistic about with development of the domestic hydrogen sector here in Atlantic Canada. David and Sandy, I really appreciate your interesting insights today, and I encourage everyone to tune in next week for another episode of Atlantic Canada's Hydrogen Journey. Maria, we really covered a lot of ground in this episode, and I'm interested to know what you took away from it.
Well, one thing that stuck with me is that the transition to hydrogen will be harder than electrification. Just think about it. Not because the technology isn't there, but because the infrastructure isn't. We already have an electrical grid, but the hydrogen value chain in Atlantic Canada, like from production to distribution to end use, will all have to be built from scratch. And then there's the chicken and egg dilemma. Who comes first? You can't build a demand without reliable and affordable supply. But it's hard to develop supply without a market. In Europe, they've tackled this with policy-driven incentives and regulations, the carrots and sticks that push industry to make the switch. Will Atlantic Canada follow suit? So what do you think, Derek?
Well, Maria, one of my big takeaways was about the importance of collaboration. Both David and Sandy talked about the need to build a coalition of the willing. So companies, public sector leaders, and other stakeholders who have a shared vision, they need to come together and also work together to build the domestic hydrogen value chain in Atlantic Canada from the ground up. And then I also thought Sandy made an important point that the hydrogen sector in Atlantic Canada should keep top of mind. And his point was that there will be skepticism. Atlantic Canada has seen this story before. We've had big energy projects come and go, like Sable offshore gas. We've had failed LNG terminals. So our region has this history of early optimism and then disappointment. But green hydrogen could be different. This time we're not just another small player in a massive oil and gas market. Instead, by getting in early, we really could be world leaders in green hydrogen, but it's going to take work and perhaps shovels in the ground to turn some of those skeptics into believers. So those were my two big takeaways, Maria.
Well, thanks, Derek. And now that episode number 2 is in the books, if people are just joining us, make sure you tune in to episode 1, where Derek had a wonderful conversation with Dave McGregor. And if you want to learn more about Atlantic Canada's hydrogen future, check out the Hydrogen East Conference that's happening April 14th and 15th at the Halifax Convention Centre. It's taking place alongside the Smart Energy Halifax conference. The registration link is in the show notes, or you can visit hydrogenhalifax.com. I'm your host of Reimagined Energy, Maria McGowan, and along with your guest, our guest, Derek Estabrook. Thanks for listening in today.